Yes, I think I'm unmuted, Rishika, right? You can hear me? Yes, that's good news, because indeed then we shall start. We have lots of people in the webinar room, and I see lots of familiar faces. So welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by the Netherlands Embassy. My name is Anouk Paron, I'm Deputy Ambassador. I'm here with my Senior Economic Advisor, Shanila, and also online with the colleagues from the International Water Management Institute, with whom we are together convening you online again. I can see participants from the Maldives, from Sri Lanka, and also the Netherlands, and from the government, private sector, including banks as well, and academia and NGOs. And it's a great mix to have all of you here again. And it is actually on your request that we organized this webinar on accessing climate finance. Let me start with some practical comments. We video this webinar so we can share it more broadly. And kindly keep yourself muted. Of course, you can pose questions later on in this webinar, and then we'll use the chat box. So for now, let me go into the topic of today and give you a bit of background on earlier discussions, so you know why we focus on accessing climate finance today. I think we can all agree that climate change is a defining issue of our time, because in fact the economic consequences of climate finance are already in evidence. Sri Lanka's economy, as many of you know and experience daily, is highly dependent on climate sensitive sectors such as agriculture, tourism, and also energy. And for the Maldives, climate challenges present an existential threat. So the Netherlands Embassy has been engaged with Sri Lanka and the Maldives on implementing the nationally determined contributions to implement the Paris Agreement for a long time, and we focus especially on NDCs related to water, and also on how to engage the private sector in achieving those NDCs, which is why we focus this event on the private sector as well. And meanwhile, as we were engaging, we of course witnessed and observed all the international negotiations on climate change in the different COPs, and we saw all the developments in Sri Lanka and the Maldives. And what we saw was more political attention, and also attention in your sectors for climate adaptation and mitigation. And the big question, the elephant in the room, how to finance climate adaptation and mitigation. Because indeed, in the challenging current economic situation, climate finance could enable a unique opportunity for development to be more inclusive and sustainable. So that is why, together with IWMI, we organized a joint dialogue on climate change in October, and many of you were present there physically on that day, which was to further the thinking and also preparations for COP27. And during that day, we did one workshop on climate finance. And then many of the people who are now in the online room actually pointed out to us that you wanted to learn more. And you also wanted to look beyond COP27, amongst others to the UN 2023 Water Conference, which is in March in New York, and which is co-hosted by the government of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. To give a bit of background for those who don't know about that conference yet, it is an international conference, a UN conference that aims to accelerate worldwide progress on water challenges, for example, in the water and sanitation field, but also connecting climate change and water goals in the upshot to COP28. And this is because both water challenges are both the deal breaker and also the deal maker to achieve international climate goals, of course. So it's a UN conference, also for your governments, for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. They will be participating. So having listened to you, we decided two things to follow up on that joint dialogue in October, to do the session today on accessing climate finance, and with your input, do a preparation session for the UN 2023 Water Conference in March. So this is the background on why we are together here online today in this first follow-up to that October session of the joint dialogue. And the aim is to give you what you asked for, namely more insights into how to access international climate finance. So what are we doing today? We have a panel with 4 expert panelists gathered for you from the Dutch Development Bank FMO, from IWMI, the Global Green Growth Institute, and also the Ministry of Finance from Sri Lanka. I will introduce these experts later, one by one. After their introductions, you can, of course, pose questions to them via the chat box. But first, we will get a presentation from one of the panelists. His name is David Kuiper. And earlier in his long career, he was actually a diplomat for the Netherlands, focusing on climate, water, and energy. And then he moved to the World Bank, and now he is the manager of the Public Investment and Blended Finance at FMO, which is the Dutch Development Bank. FMO is an investor in Sri Lanka as well. The current investment portfolio is about 100 million euros, mostly focusing on the agricultural sector. But that might increase if and when more blended climate finance enters Sri Lanka, because FMO is investing in different climate finance vehicles. And David, of course, knows much more about this, so let's listen to him first. He will share some of the instruments available for Sri Lankan and Maldivian organizations and governments, and also his insights on what development banks find useful in the lead generation stage. So I will give the floor to David first, and then we will engage in the panel discussion with all the panelists and also open the floor to questions from all the participants that are here with us today. So David, please enlighten us more. I do see that you started talking, but I can't hear you. Rishika, I think we need to manually unmute David as well. Yes, there you go.
There I go. Very good. Thank you so much, Anouk, for an excellent introduction. And I think you already quite well summarized what FMO is doing, and summarized the issues around climate finance. I do have a presentation, so I'm looking at the organization of this to see whether I can share my screen with the yes. Participants.
Yes, David, we have given you access to share.
It still says host disabled participant screen sharing, so
hold on.
I do not.
Try again now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I would like to start off with a small introduction to FMO, where why in particular I will drill down later on into the more climate finance related activities of FMO. I'm actually joined here by my colleague Jim Brans of Climate Fund Managers, which is a facility, an organization set up by FMO with a specific purpose to help accelerate climate finance. So his expertise is also very much welcome in this panel. And later on during my presentation, I will ask Jim to delve a bit deeper into the Climate Investor 2 facility in particular, which is focused on the climate adaptation and water finance in particular. The Dutch Entrepreneurial Development Bank has been existing since 1970. We've grown a lot, especially in the last 6 years, with the upcoming of the SDGs, with the COP conferences. There is clearly a increased attention to the role of DFIs and DFIs are development finance institutions such as FMO, to the role of DFIs in accelerating climate finance globally. So that growth you can see on this screen. We are currently having a committed portfolio of 12.5 billion euro. And by the way, these are 2021 figures. And we offer 5 different products, 4 of which you can see here. We do loans, we do syndicated loans, we do private equity, we do guarantees. And most of all, what is important is that we're not just a finance institution. We are actually offering, together with our finance, strong capacity development and corporate governance programs to help companies evolve into healthy businesses that are very much attracting other forms of finance, in particular commercial investment.
Sorry,
and
David.
That is, of course,
Sorry,
our. So where I left this off was with the product offering of FMO. So we're not just a finance institution. We are also offering capacity development and corporate governance advice to businesses in order to help them transform to a business that's able to attract additional commercial investment. Our strategy is fully aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we have decided to actually focus on 3 goals in particular. With these 3 goals, the reducing inequality goal, reducing poverty, and the climate action goals, we are focusing in 3 particular sectors: agriculture, and Anouk already mentioned that is a sector of particular importance for FMO in Sri Lanka, financial institutions, and energy. What do we do to actually help accelerate the flow of commercial finance to developing markets? For that, we have what we call a progression model, which means, and it's a real pity that I can't show the slide. Maybe later on during the discussion, I can put that on the screen. Which means that we try to be active in all phases of market development. We try to be active in a very early stage in what we call market creation, where with grant funding, we try to translate early opportunities into bankable deals. Then with the public funding that we manage, and that is particularly my responsibility within FMO, we try to set up these bankable deals and make these more attractive to commercial investors, and more attractive to FMO itself. With our balance, we try to scale these projects with our own finance, and then sell on to commercial and institutional investors to help investments scale. So this is what we call the pioneer develop scale model, or progression model, through which is at the heart of FMO, through which FMO is organized. I would like to zoom in this presentation, in particular, on our public fund management, because what we do is we work with public partners such as the Dutch government, the UK government, the European Commission, and the Green Climate Fund, to help them manage public funds and facilities that help attract additional private finance. And that's the essence of accelerating climate finance, and that's the essence behind the ambition of the COPs. How do you actually do this? How do you set up funds and facilities that help us bring to the 100 billion a year? That is one of the COP. That is the main COP promise. So for that purpose, we are setting up, and we have set up, various public funds. In particular, we started off with about 20 years ago with Dutch government funds, such as a large fund for accelerating investments in financial institutions. That's called the Massief Fund. An access to energy fund, which is very much focused on climate mitigation and equitable access to energy for all. And lately, in the last 5 years, we've been working with the European Commission to set up various guarantee programs. And we have worked also since 2017. We are an accredited entity of the Green Climate Fund. We've worked with the Green Climate Fund to help set up investments into blended finance facilities of the Green Climate Fund. And that's in particular investments in Climate Investor 1 and Climate Investor 2. Let me quickly zoom in on that because we are focusing here on climate finance. So climate finance has achieved some notable successes in recent years. It's growing. Investments at this moment are particularly higher than they were in 2015, 2016. But what we do see is a big lagging behind, in particular in climate adaptation finance. So adaptation flows in developing countries are estimated just to be over $20 billion at this moment, and estimates of need for adaptation finance by 2030 are more in the area of 140 to $200 billion. And this neglect is something we would like to tackle. And for that purpose, together with the Dutch government, we set up 4 years ago the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. And the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development actually employs a unique concept where we're trying to bring the origination capacity of several NGOs to bring the origination capacity of them close to the financing capacity and the scaling finance capacity of two large financiers, one of which is FMO and the other one is climate fund managers. It's a pity I cannot show the slide here because it's a intricate structure that the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development has, with at its core the origination facility, where NGOs help source projects, and these projects are then, once they have been made bankable, moved to a land use facility managed by FMO itself and a water facility called Climate Investor 2, managed by our partner climate fund managers. So that Dutch Fund for Climate and Development has been working now for about 3 years, and we're about to significantly scale up the concept by attracting the support of the European Commission. We recently managed to obtain a guarantee from the European Commission that helps us significantly enhance the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development and enhance its possibilities to scale up climate finance. Maybe Jim, if you could come in here to explain a bit how Climate Investor 2 works, which is an example of a blended finance facility that uses public funding to construct what we call assets, to construct investments that are then able to attract other commercial and institutional investment. Jim, I don't know if you have a PowerPoint presentation, but maybe you could come in here to explain a bit the details of Climate Investor 2, and then I propose we go to the questions later. Jim, are you there?
I see Jim is unmuted, and I very much agree with your proposal, David. And Jim, if you could, in your contribution, focus on how is this CFM also interesting for Sri Lankan and Maldivian government entities and the private sector present in the room. And here I would like to especially acknowledge that Mr. Ruwan Wijewardena has joined us. He is one of the key climate advisors and negotiators in COPs for Sri Lanka. And we also have the colleagues from the Maldives interested in Climate Investor 2 now present in the room. Thank you, Jim.
I can. Can you hear me, Anouk?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Oh, great. All right. So nice to be here, and thanks for the invite, Anouk and David. So my name is Jim Brands. I'm with Climate Fund Managers, so a joint venture between FMO and Sanlam Infraworks, which is an infrastructure investor from South Africa. Maybe to set one step back. So what we do is we are a blended finance facility. So we try to use public finance to mobilize private sector finance at scale. And while doing this, we try to have a climate impact, being mitigation or adaptation. And we try to provide attractive returns by using this blended finance structure for commercial or private sector investors to make them interested. We started in 2017 with our initial fund called Climate Investor One, which is also eligible, or where Sri Lanka and the Maldives are also eligible for investments. And this fund mainly focuses on grid energy solutions, so wind, solar, and hydro. But what I'm here to talk about today is Climate Investor 2, which is our second fund, which focuses on water, sanitation, and ocean infrastructure. And we started with this fund in 2019 after an anchor investment of the Dutch government via the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, which David alluded to, with the idea of graduating projects that had been sourced by our NGO partners WWF and SNV, and then get a grant, and then to go to our facility, which steps I'll explain in a bit, to get to a full construction or equity investment, and then to come to an operational phase where, for example, in the example of water, safe drinking water is provided, and the project can be safely refinanced. Climate Fund Managers sits over 4 different offices worldwide. So we have an office in The Hague where I sit, but really the action happens in local offices. So we recently opened one in Bogota. We have one in Cape Town, and the one most relevant for you in the Maldives and Sri Lanka would be in Singapore, where we have 25 people looking at our investments. And then to talk a bit about the structure. So what we try to do, and what we do very different from normal project financiers, is that we basically operate 3 different funds that invest into projects in different parts of their life cycle. And this came after the finding that project finance, so basically the construction of anything infrastructure related, often is very much delayed because there's different stages with different investors that are interested in looking at that stage. And to tackle this, we create 3 different funds, one being called the Development Fund, which is the initial one. And this is solely financed by donors. So the Green Climate Fund, the European Commission, the Dutch government, the US government, and the Nordic Development Fund. And this development fund provides reimbursable grants to project companies to do all the studies they need to do to ensure the project is environmentally, technically, and financially sustainable. So here you have to think of a developer that needs, say, $4 to $5 million to really develop the project, but doesn't get any cash flows in yet, so is in a very hard position to get finance on normal capital markets. So we can do that for them. We can take up to 90% of the total finance required, and then help the project developer through this phase until there's a point where we say, well, we think everything's in order. We can go to the next stage and we can really start constructing this. So in terms of water, it would be building the destination plant. At this point, we have a construction equity fund that takes up to $100 million ticket sizes. Again, a very majority-driven approach. So it's a very, we take a very active approach. So in terms of all the engineering and environmental, social, safety, we're very there. And we even set up a local project office. So we'd be very excited if that be in Sri Lanka or the Maldives. And here, this fund is tranched. So it's a junior equity tranche that takes basically the most risk by governments. Then above that, there's impact investors such as FMO. And above that, there's really commercial and institutional investors such as pension funds. And because of this de-risking, we found a way to get investors, such as a Dutch insurance fund or a Dutch pension fund, that usually wouldn't want to invest in developing countries or in sectors they don't really know well, such as water infrastructure, and to get their capital in. So I'm pleased to say that we had a $850 million US dollar close 2 months ago, and we're aiming to get to 1.1 billion by the end of this year. So that leaves a very large amount of funding available. In terms of geographies, we focus on Latin America, Africa, and Asia, with about the equal split between the three. Then in terms of assets, it's mainly infrastructure, so really offtake agreements. So think of anything producing water or treating wastewater, producing waste to energy, anything to that extent. So I think this is especially relevant for the Maldives, with a lot of waste problems, I can imagine, a lot of smaller islands that require smaller desalination units. These are all things we can have a look at. And then there's another bucket, which is around 10% of the fund, which is also very interesting, I think, for both countries, which is the oceans bucket, where we have traditional infrastructure in the terms of ports and shipping, but we can also look at ecosystem protection. And this is quite niche in impact investing because it's really difficult to do, because usually ecosystems, like the coral reefs, for example, around the Maldives, would not have any revenue stream or activities that can provide a revenue stream. But we found a solution, which we call the Oceans Finance Company, which in a very savvy way restructures debt and reallocates interest rate gains to ecosystem protection. And we're about to announce a 1.1 billion transaction that we've done with this Ocean Finance Company in a Latin American country over the next few days. So yeah, that would be a very, we think, suitable solution for either Sri Lanka or the Maldives as well. And then maybe to talk a bit on how this would be accessible for anyone, we're financiers, so we're not per se developers. That means that we're not driving around looking for a plot of land to see if it would fit a windmill or whether a destination plan will be required, but we rely on project developers that reach out to us in those markets, or that are known in those markets, that have an idea that they want to bring forward. So as that, this is also really an open invitation to anyone in the room or participating online. If there's an idea that, for you it sounds it fits within this financing scheme, so requiring up to $3 million reimbursable grant, and then to get to a next stage where you would want to 20 million to 100 million in equity finance, we'd be very happy to have a look at that. And yeah, let me maybe stop there and see if there's any questions to either me. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jim, and also David. You really literally gave an open invitation to the project developers in the banks, in the private sector here in the room, and also the governments. And it was interesting to get some examples on how FMO can be de-risking and what innovative financing vehicles are already existing. And I think you also alluded to that for nature swaps. And I know there are people in the public that are very interested in that. So this was an open invitation by FMO. Please start posting your questions in the chat box, because indeed we will now also have the viewpoints from the other experts in the room adding to the conversation. Let me introduce the three of them first. So we have Mrs. Visaka Amarasekera. She has a long career in finance and is now the Additional Director General of the Department of External Researches at the Ministry of Finance in Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining today. We also have Mark Thompson from the International Water Management Institute. He is the Director of Business Strategy and Delivery at IWMI, and he's actually already preparing with stakeholders for the UN 2023 Water Conference. Some of you I know are in that preparation trajectory. It's called the Transformative Futures for Water Security Dialogues. So he is already preparing towards that water conference with you. And then last but certainly not least, we have Srinath from the Global Green Growth Institute, Srinath Komarina. He's program manager, actually working now with the government of Vietnam to develop the green bond market. So that already shows you he is a pioneer in green bonds and now also an expert advising on green bonds worldwide. So I will invite the three panelists one by one to reflect a bit on what David and also Jim have said. And meanwhile, please put your questions in the chat so I can integrate them in the questions that we start posing to the panelists now. So I would like to start by inviting Vishaka, Ministry of Finance from Sri Lanka, important stakeholder, of course, in this conversation. Vishaka, could you please share your perspectives on green and climate finance and maybe what projects are currently funded in Sri Lanka through such vehicles? Please take a few moments to share your first reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. I think David and Jim gave an excellent insight into this entire climate financing process, and some of my own questions that I was going to pose, I think to a large extent have been answered also. But to address the question that you posed in the context of what are the current perspectives on green and climate financing that Sri Lanka is right now undertaking and what type of projects we're going on. I think, as you know, Sri Lanka has had we've always focused, the country's policies have always been fairly focused on a sustainable and a green financing economy. And to that extent, successive governments had come out with various policies. You know, recently, we have had the President announcing the green economy by 2050 initiative, and and then this has also been backed by certain other policy initiatives that have been announced, including renewable energy by 70% by 2030, to name a few. And to a large extent, the country's capital investments, the government's capital investment budget, has also focused on supporting these initiatives, creating the enabling infrastructure in the country so that whoever it is can also invest and proceed thereon. And it has also included investment directly into mitigation and adaptation infrastructure. I think we found that at least around 0.2% of the budget annually has been set aside for mitigation and adaptation infrastructure, creating mechanisms and processes. So as we speak, I think even where we are today with the debt restructuring on, some of our projects have come to a standstill, but nevertheless, the projects that were there and up until recently include things like the climate resilient, the Green Power Development Project, which is financed by the AFD. The World Bank has come in with the climate resilient project. So there are a number of initiatives that we have been focused on and have proceeded on. And I must also recognize the GCF and the GEF, Jeff, and the EU also in this space that have invested and have supported the government to come in with FX financing. But I think, and to that extent, I must also note that if you take now, the President also recently announced the Climate Prosperity Plan at the COP27. And this is a roadmap that is, focused on attracting investment into the country while also accelerating the climate adaptation and bringing down the country's greenhouse emissions. And this will all require a significant amount of investments. And those investments could come from green financing itself or from whatever other sources that may be. So what the country is now focused on is actually creating the enabling environment to be in a position to access this type of financing. And that includes collaborating with a number of multilaterals and bilaterals as well, because I think we have found and that we recognize that accessing green financing is not like accessing plain vanilla financing, and that requires certain activities and certain processes to be in place, certain frameworks to be in place. And that we have found, I mean, given where the country is right now, we are at a point where we cannot access the markets right now. But we've recognized that this is the time to be prepared to be able to access the market when when things get better and when we have the macroeconomic sustainability more or less in place. So for that reason, we are proceeding on that path. And maybe I will stop for now and then let you continue with the questions that can come forward thereon.
Yes, thank you so much, Visakha, for explaining the Sri Lankan government's viewpoint on this and also the initiatives that the government does try to push, even though Sri Lanka is, of course, indeed in a debt restructuring process and in a default situation. Challenging, but as you said, climate finance and the new modalities might actually offer ways out as well. And that is where I would like to give the floor to our colleague from GGGI, Srinath, because you are, of course, specialized in green bonds, I should say. How do you look at this situation, also reflecting on FMO's vehicles? And then in the chat box, I meanwhile see a lot of, let's say, quite practical questions popping up for FMO. Let us first listen to you.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Anna. I'd like to first just carry on with what Ms. Visakha has rightly said. Right now, the government of Sri Lanka is looking at working on an enabling environment so that we know that the current challenge is the Sri Lankan government cannot access the international capital markets right now. But as Ms. Visakha has rightly said, they're actually preparing the groundwork right now. So that is most critical from a government point of view. And in this, we're happy to state that in partnership with SCAP, we are working with the government of Sri Lanka in preparing the thematic bond frameworks, which will be very useful for the government of Sri Lanka going forward. I would say not in the short term, but in the mid-term, to access the international capital markets so that all the projects which are stalled can be actually recapitalized and hit the ground. At the same time, while we're working with the government on the thematic bond framework in partnership with SCAP, GGGI is also in talks with the private sector, because for the wheels of the economy to move, it's both the government and the private sector have to work hand in hand. So right now, as we speak, there is, I would say, early interest from private sector organizations to tap the green bond markets. So we're in early talks. We're also talking to international guarantee agencies. They may not be in a position to give a guarantee to the government of Sri Lanka, but there are individual good companies in the private sector that can actually access the capital markets right now. So there's the two things that GGGI is currently focusing on in Sri Lanka: partnership with the government as well as with the private sector. At the same time, GGGI is recently we're on the verge of closing out a debt for nature swap deal in Ecuador. Hopefully that should be announced in the next 1 month. So we are planning to implement the learnings from our Ecuador as well as Senegal learnings and bring that to Sri Lanka and partner closely with the government of Sri Lanka, because we know that in the short term, from a government's point of view, that would be the most viable option on the debt for nature swaps. So yeah, basically in short, we're keeping all the options open: short-term debt to nature swaps, mid-term thematic bond frameworks with the government, and again, the short to mid-term private sector financing for capital markets.
Thank you for that very concise overview, actually, also pointing out what all the different sectors represented today in this webinar as well can be doing and actually are doing behind the scenes to indeed prepare that enabling environment or to move forward with new projects right now, which is where I would like to invite Mark from IWMI. How does your research organization, IWMI, support further access to climate finance? How do you look at all these topics on the table in this webinar, Mark?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nook. And I think just related to that were two comments that David made, one around the challenges of adaptation in terms of climate finance for adaptation, but also the point that David raised around quality of investments. And I think that's really important. as IMI, International Water Management Institute, as a research for development organisation, we're not a financier, we're not a fund manager. Our role is really working with investors and with designers of financial instruments around top quality products. And for that, what I mean is IMI's got 35 years of research for development type experience within the water space. And what we're trying to do now is work a lot more at that interface with SMEs, with innovation hubs, and these sorts of actors around the enabling environment. So we're looking at social, environmental, political, institutional type of enabling factors for the scaling and for accessing, increasing the access, particularly for SMEs. So, for example, I mean, outside of Sri Lanka, we are a consortium member of the multi-donor funded Water and Energy for Food program, the Regional Innovation Hubs, which is also supported by the Dutch government. And within that role, we work really closely with SMEs who are at that nexus of water, energy and food, investments like solar irrigation. So our work is to support them, is to work on the enabling environment and to help the facilitation of finance, but also, you know, back the winners and support the winners in terms of getting up. And with World Bank support across the CGIAR, the Accelerating Impacts for CGIAR Climate Research for Africa program, $60 million investment, which is again looking at 60 years of CGIAR research in the agricultural space and picking the winners and working out what's the scaling environment, what's the enabling environment we need for investment readiness to scale the research and development activities that are coming out of the CGIAR. Here in Sri Lanka, I think that, again, back to David's point around quality, one of the key factors here is good data and providing good data to allow informed investment decisions. So I think here we're working, we do quite a lot of work on climate investment, climate hazards, so looking at digital smart farming platforms. We're working with Department for Agrarian Development around what we call the GeoGova platform, which is providing a mechanism and a tool for SMEs, private sector, insurance companies, for the development of index insurance products and helping sort of using satellite technology to provide more data, more accurate data, and to strengthen those sort of agro-climatic advisory services. And for us, you know, we're not the fund manager. We recognise that really clearly, but we do have a role in supporting the development of these tools and the enabling environment, but also working really closely with governments, such as here in Sri Lanka, we're supported by the ADB for the handover and, I guess, sustainable implementation and management of these sorts of platforms, and then that's owned within government systems. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. In fact, you are responding to a question that popped up a number of times in the chat, namely, what does an enabling environment practically mean? You addressed from the IWMI perspective, so developing tools, the good data that you would require to further develop these investment vehicles. But I think this question is also for the Sri Lankan government, for Visakha. Some of the participants would like to understand better what does an enabling environment mean from a government perspective, and maybe also how could the participants in the room, so also from the private sector, support to that, Visakha? Would you be able to respond to that question?
Yes, I think, I mean, if you take Sri Lanka's let's say the bond issuances for the last so many years. Since 2007, we've accessed the market and we've raised about $15 billion, and we've never issued a green bond or anything of that sort. But to issue a green bond, to raise financing via a green bond, it is not, as I said before, not as simple as doing a plain vanilla bond. There are certain prerequisites that needs to be in place. For example, I mean, the central bank has already issued the green taxonomy, the sustainable financing path. Then we are now working on the green bond framework, as Srinath said just a minute ago. We're working with UNSCAP and the UNDP on this particular one. But at the same time, you must also understand now green financing for a project. Now, there are two types of financing that we are looking at. One is the direct instrument-based financing for to finance the budget, which comes directly into the budget. Then the next one is the project-based financing. That is the green financing that comes directly to projects. Now, in that context, it's a little different from the usual project that one would do with the World Bank or the ADB for that matter, because the preparatory work needs to be in place before you issue a green bond or whatever that may be to do say a wind farm or whatever, whatever that is eligible for a green financing project. So that requires a lot of work. And that work, for example, we are even contemplating creating something like a fund to support creating a green project pipeline, because the work that goes into it is significant. And then the amount of resources that is required is also significant. So we have recognized that, because once you issue a bond, you have to execute it within 2 or 3 years, not more than that. Not like a normal project financing where, you have about 7-6 years to do it. It's not like that. It's different from that. And for that reason, that enabling environment includes having those frameworks in place. And then I'm really glad to hear what the Dutch Development Bank is doing, because it's one of my pet peeves generally, because countries such as Sri Lanka can't also access it just like that. Because even if you go into the market, the rates would be pretty high. And for that reason, the guarantees and that type of collateral from the multilaterals or the bilaterals will also be interested, will also be very much part of that entire process. So all that requires time, all that requires to be in place. So that is the framework or the infrastructure that we say from the government's perspective that needs to be in place if we are going to go into the market, or if we are going to access green financing for green eligible projects. Thank you.
And just to add.
Please add to that.
Just add on to what Ms. Visakha said, because we worked on a very similar project with the government of Vietnam under the broad enabling environment for accessing green finance. As most of you are aware, one of the key things is capital markets are very time sensitive. The investors are always in a hurry. If not this, they'll always look at other investment opportunities. So one of the things which most of the governments, I'm sure the government of Sri Lanka also would be doing down the line, is in terms of how do we have clear regulations and guidelines for both, for the government as well as entities to actually access the capital markets with under the broader approval of the government of Sri Lanka, but then so that they can easily access that, because they're very time sensitive. So that is something I'm sure the government of Sri Lanka can also work on, or it could consider. Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you for that addition. Let's keep it in mind. And I see that there are in the chat box a lot of indeed quite practical questions to FMO that the colleagues Jim and David are also responding to in a written form. But to maybe summarize some of them a little bit, there seem to be a lot of participants who want to know how they can know if they are ready to access climate finance, for example, the thematic bonds that Srinath was alluding to. And what to keep in mind when accessing climate finance from an international investor's perspective. So David, could you maybe share some general thoughts to these quite broad questions?
Yeah, and I think that actually will be repeating a bit what was just said, that, and in particular in the situation in Sri Lanka at this moment, also provides an opportunity for what is maybe the most important challenge, and tackling the most important challenge in climate finance. I was just listening to Srinath's comments about the rushedness of the capital markets. So once you're in a, you're active on the capital markets, investors are looking for it. It's all very rushed. At this moment, actually, I do think Sri Lanka has an opportunity to work really hard and focused on ecosystem development, and to get into a very good place once the macroeconomic situation improves, to get in a very good place to what I would call of origination, making sure that you have the pipeline ready, that where opportunities have been translated into bankable deals. And translating opportunities to bankable deals, I think that is the art of climate finance in the first place. It's eventually not about the large investors yet. Especially in climate adaptation finance, a lot of it is pioneering. And I think a lot of the work that Jim is doing and climate fund managers is very much pioneering work that actually helps understand what challenges to overcome when originating. I also want to emphasize here, related to this, Mark's remark on data and having both a good regulatory environment for data to emerge and a good technological push for creating data, and particularly in climate adaptation, that very much benefit from new technologies. That will also greatly help in bringing these projects to market, in making investors understand what the impact of these projects is going to be. So these two challenges are really there. And actually, I would like to emphasize here the opportunity for Sri Lanka for, if I may say, for being a bit outside the capital markets at this moment, not being in the rush hour of the capital markets, to actually focus on getting a good position for the years ahead.
Thank you, David, for that opportunity viewpoint. So not being in the rush hour, now having the time to focus and do the pioneering that is required to develop the projects that can then go to the market. Talking about rush hour, we have so many questions in the chat box. It shows that the people want to go beyond the hour that we planned for this session. I am, though, not going to keep us much longer, only a few minutes, because I would like to go back to Mark. Mark, if you connect this dialogue to the UN 2023 Water Conference coming up, IWMI is already preparing. The government of Sri Lanka and the Maldives, and they will also be present in New York at this conference, which will then feed into COP28. How do you relate this discussion to that?
Yeah, thanks, Anouk. I think that the UN Water is a very significant event within the water agenda, and I think one of the constraints that we're seeing as IMI is we're moving into an inflationary period, high interest rates. You know, how attractive now are impact investments? There's challenges related to that. And I think that what we want to see a lot more of is, like FMO's model with blended finance. We want to see the IFIs, the other DFIs, get much more active in terms of their portfolios with blended finance models, to look at first loss, look at de-risking these sorts of investments. So I think that the UN Water, what we're doing with the Transformative Futures for Water Security, which has been a bottom-up, regional-led mechanism and within this region as well, is actually going to UN Water with 6 to 8 high ambition missions around what needs to be done within the water security space. And I think what's going to be central across all these missions is elevating the dialogue, the discussion around the need for mobilising private capital finance. We're looking at ODA, we're at 168 billion or something for 2022. It's just not enough. And I think the increases we're going to see in bilateral and ODA are not going to be massively significant, particularly over the next few years as we're looking at the possibility of global recession. So how do we access private finance? How do we elevate the discussion at the UN Water Week, within bilaterals, within the IFIs, to use this mechanism as a de-risking approach to help mobilise finance for these sorts of projects? So that's unlikely to be a key message that Transformative Futures for Water Security will be taking to UN Water. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for making that connection between today's discussion and then the UN 2023 Water Conference coming up in March. And that is also, for me, a way to start wrapping up today's webinar. I already in the introduction said it's not the last one. We will have a follow-up session on or around the 9th of March to prepare, together with all of you, the UN 2023 Water Conference. To wrap up today's session on accessing climate finance, I still see questions coming into the chat box. I also see that the FMO colleagues are answering most of them. Whilst they are doing that, I would like to give 30 seconds to each panelist to share their last thoughts and words. I will start with Ministry of Finance again, Sri Lankan government. Vishaka, go ahead. Your last thoughts, please.
I must say I liked that phrase, opportunities into bankable deals. And I think that's going to be the way forward for all of us in this country, because and that's exactly what we have recognized. That's exactly why we have got ourselves into the position that we, to create that enabling environment. And we hope that it will be, something that will help us ultimately to actually access the financing that we so badly need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vishaka. Srinath, your last thoughts, having heard the different contributions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, people may agree or not, but I would like to just now say that Sri Lanka right now is in the best position it can be as they're preparing the ground for a wonderful future ahead. And they're talking to the right partners, they're doing all the groundwork, because I think a lot of work behind the scenes that is happening. So the future is definitely going to be Sri Lanka's as far as climate finance is concerned.
Right, and can we add Maldives to that as well?
Sure, definitely.
Good, because those colleagues are also in the room. I'm going to David from FMO. Your last thoughts?
My last thought is really about the importance of getting blended finance right and the need for attention for that at conferences like the UN Water Week at the end of March. We're not there yet. I do not think the attention is sufficient. Also not the attention to the challenges that we face with blended finance. So I'd like to emphasize that we do need to work hard in the coming weeks to make sure that at the UN Water Week, blended finance opportunities are put in the right context and that at the UN Water Week, we are able to discuss the challenges around that.
Yes, indeed.
It's a bit of a message to you, in fact, Anouk, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
I heard that. Yeah, it's for us international civil servants and negotiators. I know the negotiators for Maldives and Sri Lanka are also with us, so we've heard your advice. And with that, I will move to Mark, but with your approval, Mark, I would like to give the word to Simon. Your colleague Simon is also here in the room, and he would like to share some concluding remarks as well. Rishika, could we unmute Simon from IWMI?
Hi, sorry, I was hoping Mark would speak first, but let me pick up. Just as we start to close, just Anouk and Shanila, thanks for this, and thanks for the continued partnership. I think when we started much earlier, what we agreed on was that we didn't want a single event, but we wanted a series of dialogues, and those dialogues should share information, experiences. This idea of an enabling environment through capacity and provision of evidence is so central, so that we move beyond a talk shop and that we actually have that environment where we can move towards action both within Sri Lanka and the Maldives, South Asia, and indeed globally, particularly in developing parts of the world. Yeah, so that's really important. I think in terms of taking it forward within Sri Lanka, I'm very hopeful. Patrick made an intervention earlier that the UN development partners will establish this climate change working group. And again, we've offered to help with that together with GGI. Looking beyond Sri Lanka, I think particularly with Maldives, I think, like you said, Anouk, in the opening, a very vulnerable state, and we would be delighted to work with you and with Sri Lankan colleagues. And then, of course, wider than that, this UN Water Conference coming up in March, and how fundamental that is going to be. You know, climate change is water, and I think picking up on some of David's points, picking up on David's points about adaptation and how that was flagging or lacking in the finances, and yet so important, as we know from many countries in South Asia. And that policy framework is there through the Paris Agreement, through Agenda 2030, and the Sendai framework for reducing risk. We've started work, I think Mark mentioned, the climate change information system. We're developing with GGI. Also, we're doing Mahavali work on watershed planning and looking up towards some tank restorations with IFAD. So a big thanks to all. I mean, I'm amazed there's over 100 participants online, which is great to see. And I think fundamental is this link between research, investors, and implementation. And so I wish you all well. We'll continue the dialogue, Anouk, as you said. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, IWMI, for indeed starting closing remarks. Mark, I saw you nodding. Anything to add to your colleague before I wrap up?
Just that idea of collaboration, in that we're not dealing with traditional capital financial markets here. This is messy, this is more tricky. So I think these sorts of dialogues and this connection on the research for development side with government, you know, how do we meet each other in the middle? Because what we need to achieve is just absolutely critical, and it's only going to happen through these sorts of collaborations. Yep, that's all. Thanks, Anouk.
Yeah, collaborations, the key word in these last closing remarks. Indeed, more than 100 people still present in this room. That shows there is commitment and understanding that this topic of climate finance is the future, basically. Which is also why this is not the last conversation we will have. As I mentioned before, we are planning to have a next session to prepare on the UN 2023 Water Conference. Hereby, I would like to invite all of you to please let us know what you would require. Last time when we met in October, you said we want more access or more information on accessing international climate finance, hence today's session. Now we need your input to organize the next one. We, of course, with me, I mean IWMI, our co-organizer, and we as the Netherlands Embassy will reach out to you. So that we can make the next session as useful, hopefully. And I see there are still questions popping into the chat box for FMO and some others. So now that you know that we can connect you to FMO, please also send outstanding questions to the Netherlands Embassy so we can connect you directly to FMO after as well. You have heard their open invitation to further explore these innovative climate vehicles. So with that, I would like to thank all the participants from the government of Sri Lanka, from the government of the Maldives, representatives from different private sector organizations, academia, and also NGOs. Thank you very much for joining us today. Send us your thoughts and feedback so that it will feed into the next session. Again, we plan to have it on the 9th of March. That date might shift depending on what happens in Sri Lanka with the local elections, but we will definitely do it before the UN Water Conference. So thanks everybody, and especially, of course, the panelists, Vishaka, Mark, David, Jim, and Srinath, and all the people behind the scenes, Rushika, and the other colleagues from Be Connected, our event organizer. Job again, very well done. Thank you very, very much, and I wish everybody a good remainder of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Anouk.
Thanks, Anouk.